Chapter 4. He was sitting in a chair, a tubular chrome and vinyl one, next to a small glass table, opposite another similar chair, in which sat a bronzed, well-groomed, middle-aged man in a blue shirt with a bit of wire sticking out of it. Behind the man's head he could see a large camera, while overhead swayed a couple of microphones and long steel poles. The man was smiling and staring past him at something, a screen on the wall, where a mob of savage and hideous goblins was stabbing and hacking at some object lying in the dust. "So, Paul," said the man, and the camera started to edge forward on its hydraulic boom, "how do you think it went?" Paul could feel the corners of his mouth pull apart in a smile, and he heard himself say, "Well, David, obviously we're a bit disappointed with the final result, but we know we gave it our best shot. Our lads all done brilliant on the day. It's just a shame someone's got to come second, really." The man nodded gravely, as though he'd just got a straight answer out of Plato. "I'd like to take you through a few of the key moments from the game, Paul, if I may. Let's kick off with the beginning, shall we? On reflection, maybe not the best start you could have got off to." On the screen, Paul saw a hospital ward, a nurse handing a bundle to a woman lying in bed, close-up of his mother's face, he recognised it from old photographs, then a smart cut across to the ugliest-looking baby Paul had ever seen, wriggling and grizzling and waving his little fists in the air. Well, David, the lads felt the conditions were dead against us. I mean, obviously they weren't what we'd have chosen for ourselves, but that's the game. You've got to play the cards you're given and just get out there and give it 110%, which maybe we didn't quite manage to do on this occasion. But it's been a learning experience for all of us, and now the screen showed a sullen-looking kid in a navy blue blazer, tie knotted under his chin, standing on his own in the corner of a crowded playground. Cut to the same small boy, sobbing in the corner of a large, sparse school bathroom, while a bunch of larger, more cheerful kids methodically flushed the contents of a school bag down a toilet. "For me," the man called Dave was saying, "it was pretty much lost and won here, right in the opening stages, and afterwards you never really had a chance to climb back into the game. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?" Paul's head nodded of its own accord. "Absolutely, David," he said. "The lads were absolutely magic and can't take anything away from them, and we're going to have to be going over the videos of this stage of the game very carefully over the summer." As his mouth moved, a little voice was whispering inside his mind, in the dark corners where nobody ever needed to go. Goblin taste, goblin humour, goblin appearances, and don't forget the one thing about goblins you really need to remember. At this point, Paul noticed he was still holding the sword. Meanwhile, "How would you react," the man called Dave was asking him, "to the guys in the media who've been saying all along that your leadership style's been too laid back and sloppy and you didn't train nearly hard enough and that really you've let the fans down back home who actually believed you could pull it off?" Paul grinned. "Like this," he said, and with a single sweep of his arm he sliced Dave's head off with the sword and watched it sail across the room, bounce off the opposite wall and land with absolute precision on a small metal dustbin. Quite a few of the cameramen cheered, and someone let off an air horn. Smiling, Paul stood up and walked away. Outside the glaring circle of the studio lights, it was dark and cool, and he was feeling quite tired. Goblins, he thought. Bless them. It stood to reason that at a goblin party you had to have beautiful girls jump up out of a cake and attack you with savage weapons, just as the goblin idea of your past life flashing in front of your eyes at the point of death was inevitably a grandstand interview. He was also absolutely convinced, though he had no data on the subject, that Goblinkind's favourite TV show was Benny Hill, but Forrest Gumped with cutting-edge computer graphics technology to include scenes of gratuitous slaughter. My relatives, he told himself. Devious, vulgar, and blessed with a degree of cunning that it was fatally easy to underestimate, but flawed nevertheless with the assumption that everyone was like them deep down. Outside the immediate confines of the genome, however, they hadn't a clue. Of course, he reflected as he walked further into the darkness, he did have the fairly unique advantage of having died twice already. Arguably, if he didn't have that rather unusual insight, which quite possibly they weren't aware of, it was quite likely that he would believe he'd just been killed, and that this was the underworld, the afterlife, the kingdom of the dead. In any event, he felt he'd established beyond reasonable doubt that that was what they wanted him to think, which led on to the thorny question, why? What good was it doing them, and how could it possibly be relevant to the christening of baby Paul Azog? Paul wrestled with that one for a while, but try as he might, he couldn't find a satisfactory answer, so he shelved the question and began to speculate about what might happen next. Not that it mattered. After all, none of this was real, so none of it mattered. He knew it wasn't real because he knew precisely what the realm of the dead looked like. Dark, flat, featureless, neither hot nor cold, dry nor wet, nothing so positive. And after a while, when you got bored with strolling across a blank canvas, you came to the entrance to the Bank of the Dead, where Mr. Dow would be waiting to greet him. Paul? The voice was familiar. He looked around, trying to see where it was coming from, but realised that he was completely disoriented in this dark, flat, featureless landscape. Pause. Rewind. Freeze. Come to think of it, he muttered to himself, it's also neither cold nor hot, wet nor dry. And the voice he'd just heard was that of Benny Shumway. He opened his mouth to yell, but nothing came out. Shit, Paul, I didn't know, Benny's voice went on. Nobody ever tells me anything around here. Bloody hell, mate, I'm so sorry. Hesitation rather than a pause for a reply. Benny had been here often enough, once a day to pay in the cheques, draw the petty cash, check the automated credits, to know that the dead can't answer back or see you. They can only just hear your voice, faint and coming from no particular direction. Well, Benny continued awkwardly, I just hope it was painless and quick, and tomorrow I'll see about bringing you something, a drop of goat's blood or a bit of raw liver. I really am sorry, chum. You got right up my nose sometimes, and I can never forgive you for sending Judy away, but some of the time I actually did quite like you. Benny, wait for me. Get me out of here. There's been a terrible mistake. Don't go. Paul could just hear an echo of the words inside his own head, but no voice speaking them. Really, nothing more than the shape and shadow of the thoughts, and that only because he was so recently arrived. Of course Benny couldn't hear him, because Benny was still alive. Desperately, Paul tried to see something, any damn thing, or hear, or smell, or touch, or taste. No dice. Then, just as he'd found a crumb of reassurance in the fact he hadn't seen the bank or Mr. Dow, another familiar voice spoke out of the darkness and spoiled all of that forever. Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Dow said, again, what on earth brings you here? And there he was, exactly the way Paul remembered him. Grave, distinguished, almost sympathetic and kindly, but not quite. Mr. Dow, manager of the bank, walked out of the absence of light and bowed formally to him. Mr. Dow, look, this is wrong. I shouldn't be here. A gentle glow of pity and understanding in his eyes, deep as an artesian well. Alas, Mr. Dow said, how often I have heard those very words, and always so true. Of course you shouldn't be here, Mr. Carpenter. Nobody should be here. But, he shrugged, thin shoulders lifting a little under the deep blue silk of his robes, we all have our cross to bear, Mr. Carpenter, and in the end we all can do is make the best of it. You'll find it isn't as bad as all that here. We have a bridge club, if you play at all, and a very strong choral society, or you can sign up for an excellent choice of evening classes. Only the other day, for instance, we added flower arranging, conversational Turkish, and beginner's level lawnmower maintenance. I won't pretend that everything here isn't agonizingly boring and pointless, but we do make an effort. This is wrong, Paul repeated helplessly. This is wrong. It's just Mr. Tyler's mum and her loathsome relatives playing a stupid trick on me. You're not the real Mr. Dow, you're just... His ghost. Mr. Dow smiled wanly. To coin a phrase, this is as real as I get. He folded his arms and tucked his hands into his capacious sleeves. Mr. Carpenter, he said, then made a supreme effort. Paul, if I may, I'm sorry. There has been no mistake. Your name is there on the arrivals board, which is why I came out specifically to meet you. There is an explanatory note. It says killed by goblins. If that's any help to you in understanding the sequence of events, not that it matters. You must face this fact. As far as you are concerned, nothing matters. Nothing will ever matter again. We used to have a banner, Paul. We rigged it out over the front entrance every time new guests arrived until the time and motion consultants pointed out that it was depressing and counterproductive and made us throw it away. But I disagree with them. It said, abandon hope, O ye who entered here. And I still maintain that it was the best and most constructive advice that can be given to someone in your present situation. You must accept this, Paul.
Down here, hope is not your friend. There is nothing to hope for here, just as there is nothing to be afraid of. Quite simply, there is nothing. Deal with it."
Paul stared at Mr. Dow for a moment. Then it was as though he'd just woken up out of a particularly vivid and disturbing dream to find himself in his bed, in his red and white striped pyjamas, suddenly and rather foolishly aware that he'd gotten himself into a dreadful state over nothing at all. Just as the dream fades and gets thin and evaporates as the light bleaches it away, so his memories of having been alive, all the stuff he'd tried to bring with him and now realised that he wouldn't be needing after all, began to melt and thaw away, because he'd woken up out of a strange and disturbing dream about being alive. But it was all right now, and he knew that it'd all been just a... "No," he said. "No," he repeated. "Sorry, but it can't be like that. I mean, they wouldn't have killed me. They had no reason to. I was being little Paul Azog's godfather." Mr. Dow was frowning sympathetically, but frowning nonetheless.
"They're goblins, Paul," he said. "That's reason enough. Human sacrifice is part of their rich cultural heritage, but you mustn't worry about that any more. The important thing is that you're here, and this time you are here to stay. Now I'm prepared to bend the rules for you a bit until you've got yourself settled in, but there is a very definite limit to what I can do, and in a day or so, once you're acclimatized."
"No!" It wasn't in Paul's nature to shout at people he didn't know well, but the circumstances seemed to warrant making an exception. "I'm not going to get acclimatised because I'm not staying. This isn't happening. I demand to see the manager." Mr. Dow, and he shook his head.
"I am the manager,"
he said. "No, you aren't." No, it occurred to Paul to consider he wasn't the manager at that. "You're in charge of the bank, but you're not the government around here. I want to see whoever's in charge, and that's not you." Mr. Dow smiled wryly.
"Take me to your leader, in other words. I'm sorry, but we haven't got one. No need, you see. There's nobody in charge because there's nothing to be in charge of, except the bank, of course. Please, I must ask you to calm down and try and behave in a manner that is less unseemly. Perhaps," he added with a friendly gesture, "I can get you something to eat or drink. A cup of tea, perhaps, and a plate of mixed biscuits." And maybe it was Paul's imagination, or maybe as he said that, Mr. Dow winked. A tiny flicker of the lid of his logically non-existent eye. A hint. Of course, he was still holding the sword. You can't take it with you, they say, but sometimes, Paul realised with a jolt, they lie. He was still holding the sword, with which he so lightly and easily decapitated the annoying TV anchorman. As he swung it up and looked at the blade, a deep, rich, glowing brown, flecked here and there with swirls and squiggles of vivid silver, he imagined that he saw Mr. Dow's chin dip just a tiny bit, almost as if he was nodding in approval, in confirmation. How could he still have the sword if he was really dead? Vaguely he remembered Magnus Magnusson or someone like that telling him through a plate glass screen that dead Vikings always liked to be buried with their swords, to have something to defend themselves with in the next world. Magnus had made it sound pretty silly, but here he was in the next world, and here was this sword in his hand, a hand he shouldn't still have, but somehow the realness of the sword was soaking through into his skin. He thought of a film he'd seen once, a sci-fi thing about an invisible man, and they'd caught him by spraying paint about from aerosols. The skin of his hand was real where it touched the sword in the same way that the invisible man's face could be seen by the infinitesimally thin layer of paint covering it. Cool, he thought, and then he took another look at the sword blade. "Excuse me," Paul said to Mr. Dow, when he lifted the blade to his mouth and carefully licked along the line of the cutting edge, feeling his tongue become real again as it touched the cold, smooth metal. There was only a very thin smear of blood there, but he knew from his 2 previous visits that a tiny, tiny drop of the red stuff was all it took. It was as though he was a line drawing in a child's colouring book, and the child had just coloured him in, gaudily and messily, with a broad-nibbed felt-tip pen. He was suddenly so full of life that it was sloshing about inside him like water in a bucket, spilling out of him, dripping off him like wet paint. Sorry, he heard himself say. "Can't stop. Thanks for everything." Mr. Dow lifted his hand in a very small wave as Paul spun on his heel. He had heels to spin on once again. Wasn't that amazing? And then sprinted like hell in what he devoutly hoped was the direction of the little postern gate that opened into Benny Shumway's office. As he ran, he worried.
He'd been in this position before, of course. There was a door linking the cashier's room at J.W. with the land of the dead, but as soon as Benny got back from his daily trip to the bank, the door was bolted and locked and chained and barred, and wouldn't be opened again for 23.5 hours, by which time the tiny lease of life afforded him by the tiny smear of blood he had licked off the sword would have expired, and that'd be that. But he met Benny not all that long ago, and Benny didn't run home from doing the banking. He tended to trudge wearily, like a man wading through waist-deep porridge. If he could get to the door before Benny did, he was saved. If not, forget it. Simple as that. A bit like running for a train, Paul thought, except that there won't be another one if I miss this one. Not ever. He was running into complete darkness, nothing to navigate by, nothing underfoot even, to confirm that he was moving rather than standing still. That wasn't a nice thought, but he made an effort and ran faster anyhow, and then there was a tiny point of light, no bigger than a star, which he knew was the glow from the 60-watt bulb in the cashier's room, seen through the keyhole. Time for an extra special effort, because if he could see the light, it was because the door was still unlocked and the keyhole cover hadn't been swung back. He also yelled, "Benny, Benny," at the top of his voice, but he couldn't hear his own words. Then there was Benny, briefcase in one hand, big folder of papers wedged under the other arm. There he was, and there was the door, but he was right on the doorstep, and Paul was still 100 yards or 1,000 yards or 1,000,000 miles away, and he wasn't going to get there in time, because Benny was way too smart to look over his shoulder when he was in the kingdom of the dead. Paul watched him reach for the door handle. His fingers were on the knob about to turn it, but a couple of sheets of paper slipped out of the folder and drifted to the absence of ground, and Benny swore under his breath and stooped to pick them up. "Benny!" Paul yelled, pounding forward like a racehorse. "It's me, Benny! Wait for—" No more than 10 yards away now, 3 strides, but Benny had picked up his papers and turned to the door handle and opened the door. At the last moment, Paul shut his eyes tight and leapt like a deer into the blinding rectangle of light and crashed into something profoundly solid, bounced off and landed on his back, stunned and breathless. He lay unable to move as the sound of bolts and keys and chains and latchets crashed and graunched at him through the woodwork. A fraction of a second later, he was on his feet again, hammering with both fists against the rough oak panels, howling and yelling and screaming, but he knew he was wasting his time. Benny Shumway hadn't lasted this long without knowing that this was one door you never answered, no matter what you heard on the other side. That was it then. Screwed. Paul slumped to the lack of ground, almost too weak to move. The desperate exertion of all that running, yelling and bashing had used up most of his little wispy smear of extra life, and in a few seconds it'll all be gone, and so would he. Suddenly he thought of the sword. Maybe there was an atom or so of blood left on the blade that he'd missed, or maybe the sword, being magical, could cut through 2 inches of oak like a cake slice through lemon meringue. But the sword wasn't there. Either it had gone through the doorway before Benny shut the door, or Paul had dropped it at some point in his wild dash, out there, in the total absence of light, where he'd never find it again, even if he had all eternity to look. Which he would. Fuck, he thought. He'd believed he was going to make it, right up to the point where his face slammed into the closed door. He'd been utterly, unshakably convinced that this wasn't the end. He'd had the sword, and it wasn't fair anyhow, being suddenly murdered by goblins when he was the one doing them a favour. If it was the end, why bother giving him the sword and sacrificing the life of a TV presenter, just so there'd be blood on it when blood was needed? And why have Benny Shumway there at precisely the critical moment, even the pantomime with the dropped papers, to buy him the essential fraction of a second? But apparently not. Abandon hope, all you who enter here. Goblin humour, he thought. Round about now, it'd be just his luck to see Jonathan Ross or Barry Norman floating eerily in the gloom, because now's the time for a frank, trenchant review of my life, now that it's over, now that the fat lady's straining for the high notes. Conclusions, anyone? First of all, it was a waste of time, because nothing worthwhile would end this way, massacred by pretty girls jumping out of a cake, leaping headlong into a shut door. Second, if I had my time over again. There had been a very brief moment, a split second, when the road of Paul's life had forked, and he'd had a genuine choice. After Sophie had told him about how Countess Judy had leached out all her feelings for him, as though they'd never existed, Sophie had made him a remarkable and genuine offer. She'd said that if he wanted her to, she would drink the justly celebrated J.W. patent love filter and make herself fall in love with him, unconditionally, forever. He'd looked at her in amazement and horror, because it wasn't fair to confront him with a choice like that. As his world spun around him, upside down and out of control, he'd struggled to find some fixed point whereby to make his choice, and, of course, he'd hit upon what's the right thing to do. Once he'd made that call, the rest was easy. No, he couldn't let Sophie drink the filter, because then her love for him would be a lie, synthetic, involuntary, like plastic flowers or British lager, not real, lifeless, worthless. So he'd done what he knew was the right thing, and both of them had lived wretchedly ever after, until now, of course. There had been a very brief moment, a split second, and Paul had chosen to do what he thought was right, which was fine, in a way, because at least it was a criterion, albeit a totally random and arbitrary one, like choosing someone to be Prime Minister by the length of their toenails. At the time, he'd had no way of knowing that it was also a wretched, stupid mistake, which he could now say with total accuracy he'd regretted for the rest of his life. Annoying, really, since it had been, he now realised, with the benefit of hindsight, not to mention the added clarity which comes with being effectively dead, the only decision he'd ever faced which really mattered. He'd loved and won and lost and screwed up. Regrets, he thought. I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. Except for that one colossal and unforgivable exception, that howling, staring, screaming example of taking the eye off the ball when it really mattered. Which is why it was basically a pretty bad break for him, dying like this with his one great act of stupidity unpurged and now incapable of absolution. I let some trivial shit like right and wrong come between me and the girl I actually, genuinely, truly love. That was not good. Wish I hadn't done that, but now it's too late to set it right, and accordingly the world will be out of true forever. While there'd been life, there'd been hope. Now there was just anger, frustration, and the infuriating knowledge that he'd lived and died an idiot. I would really, Paul thought, really like to see the manager. I have a few things to say about the way this outfit is run. You did your best, said Mr. Dow, somewhere behind him. I knew you wouldn't be able to truly accept, until it was brought home to you in the most unequivocal terms. You aren't the manager, Paul growled back, not looking around, because you didn't. Benny had taught him that, just like the living must never accept food or drink in the land of the dead. True, there is no manager, therefore it follows that I am not him. At least now you should have got hope out of your system. Go away, Paul said, and he knew he was being rude, and he didn't care. I've still got a second or two left. I can feel it. Come back later, when you're entitled. As you wish. Mr. Dow didn't sound offended, just rather sad. If you insist on it, you still have 3 minutes and 27 seconds. I fear, however, that in the context of eternity... Say that again, Paul interrupted. 3 minutes and 27 seconds. 24 seconds now, of course. Mr. Dow, Paul stood up, faced his interlocutor and smiled broadly. Is the bank still open? I want to make a withdrawal. 1 minute, 6 seconds to walk to the bank, 15 seconds to fill in the necessary forms, 1 minute, 32 seconds to walk down the corridor and down the stairs to the safety deposit vault, 5 seconds to find the box with his name on it, rip it out of the rack and tear off the lid. Really, Mr. Carpenter, said Mr. Dow. So Mr. Carpenter again, am I? Fine. Are you sure? 1 second to say, fuck you, to Mr. Dow, 3 seconds to unroll the thin sheet of plastic from its cardboard tube and press it against the vault wall, 1 second to open it and say, home. Piece of cake, Paul thought, as he stumbled through and slammed the door behind him. The door, the Acme portable door, slowly peeled off the back wall of his bedroom and landed in a heap on the floor. Piece of cake, Paul thought again, as his legs buckled under him and he collapsed on the bed, bounced twice and lay absolutely still, listening to the pounding of his real, functional heart. 1 whole second to spare, and to think for a moment there I was starting to fret. His hands felt sticky, Well, he would after all that. And it was also a miracle he hadn't thrown up or wet himself. But it wasn't that kind of sticky. Blood? He scrunched his fingertips across his palms. Squidgy, but not like blood. Thicker. Purely out of curiosity, he lifted one hand and looked at it. Some kind of yellow slime. Ugh. He wiped his hands on the duvet, shut his eyes, and because he'd earned it, he deserved it, and now he was going to enjoy it, saw there. He screamed. "Charming," said a voice. Never, not even in the ecstatic throes of terror or relief, a moment's bloody peace. Paul choked off his scream and sat bolt upright. "You!" he squawked, because of all the things he'd seen in the last 24 hours, this was the hardest to believe in. What the fuck?" "Brought you a piece of cake," said Mr. Tanner's mum, and she held out a paper plate on which rested a rather meagre slice of squished-up fruit and some crumbled white plaster. "Since you couldn't be there for the party afterwards." Couldn't be there," Paul repeated in a dazed voice, as though he was asking the voice from the burning bush. "Hold on a second. Tell me again, what was that bit just after 'thou shalt not'?" "You horrible bloody lunatic, you killed me!" Mr. Tanner's mum grinned at him, smile and long sharp teeth in roughly equal parts. "You're looking well on it, I must say. Anyhow, I think it went off pretty well, all things considered. You missed the speeches, of course. Uncle Jerry went on far too long, but..." Desperately, Paul wanted to throw something at her, or hit her with something, but there wasn't anything within easy reach except a pillow and his pyjamas. Did you hear what I just said? You fucking murdered me. I died. Did you know that? I actually died." She nodded. "Well, of course," she said, "but I knew you'd be all right. That was the whole point, after all." Trying to be hysterically angry with Mr. Tanner's mum was a bit like trying to put out an Australian bushfire by crying on it. "You're mad," he said. "Completely out of your tree. How the hell did you know I'd be all right?" A click of her scaly red tongue, mildly reproachful, a sort of motherly "don't do that, dear," unspoken rebuke. "I knew you'd be all right," she repeated, "and you are. I knew what you'd do, and you did it. What's hard to grasp about that?" You? There comes a point where you can be too bewildered to be angry. How could you possibly know what I was going to do? I didn't know until I only had 3 minutes left. I got out of there with 1 fucking second to spare." "Really? But it was so obvious. You told me yourself when Countess Judy got put away in Avalon. You'd taken the portable door and stashed it away in the bank so nobody could ever get their hands on it again and misuse it for their own evil ends. And you knew perfectly well that the door would get you into or out of absolutely anywhere at all. So naturally, as soon as you realised you were dead, you went to the bank, got it out of your safe deposit box and came home through it. Not exactly rocket science." She paused and then frowned at him. "You're saying that wasn't the first thought that crossed your mind, right?" Put like that, it did sound fairly reasonable. I was confused," Paul said, just a smidge defensively. "Also bewildered and scared, absolutely shitless, and..." "You panicked." No, yes, of course I panicked. I'd just been killed by goblins. Goblins, Paul added bitterly, in spandex catsuits and little white bunny tails jumping out of a cake. Whatever else I may eventually forgive you for, I will never, ever..." "That wasn't my idea," Mr. Tanner's mum said quickly. "That was our Dennis. Said he thought it appealed to your offbeat sense of humour, whatever that means. Anyhow, you got off lightly, if you ask me. Cousin Howard and Uncle Tony had set their heart on a bevy of kissogram girls with obsidian daggers. I'm afraid he's a bit unregenerate, my Uncle Tony." But... There was a whirlwind of questions inside Paul's head, and for a long time he couldn't pick out which one he really needed an answer to. "Why?" he eventually chose. "Why what?" "Why did you have me murdered, you evil bitch? Just to see if I would escape? What was it, a bet or something?" "Don't be ridiculous. No, you had to go to the bank to collect little Paul Azor's christening present. That is, somebody had to go, and you're the only person we could think of who'd be able to get back again." "Christening present?" Paul broke off and stared at her. "What, I was supposed to pick up some rotten little pewter tankard or something? Well, you've had that because I didn't." Patient little sigh. "Yes, you have, silly. There it is. Look, on the floor over there."
Wouldn't have been any need, she added reproachfully, if you hadn't gone and put it there in the first place. Your own silly fault, really.
Paul turned his head to look, just in case he'd overlooked something. What are you talking about?
The door thing, stupid. The Acme portable door. Paul Azog's Prezi.
All the rage and fury came back at once, like water rushing from a broken pipe. But that... He can't have that. It's mine.
Your own. Mr. Tanner's mum sighed. You're precious. Sorry, but you're forgetting something, aren't you? Like how you came by it in the first place.
Paul opened his mouth and then shut it again. I found it, he muttered, in my desk.
In the top left-hand drawer of your desk, Mr. Tanner's mum confirmed, where I left it for you. Alone, she added, not a gift, and now you've got to give it back. Sorry, she added, but you should have guessed at the time. It's a really, really powerful magical object. Stands to reason it must belong to someone. And who else around here likes you enough to lend you something like that when you really needed it?
Yes, but...
But what?
Paul couldn't think of anything to say.
And then when you'd finished with it, you went and stuck it in the bank where nobody but you could ever get at it again. So, she went on, with a mild sigh, it's not like we had any choice in the matter. You put it there, you had to go back and get it. Thanks, she added. Sorry for any inconvenience. Eat your cake. It's not nearly as revolting as it looks.
Paul looked at the plate lying on the bed beside him. No thanks, he said stiffly. It's had goblins in it. All right, so it's your door. But why the hell couldn't you have told me instead of having me killed like that? Have you got any idea how close I came to...
Well, I can't help if you're not nearly as bright as I assumed you were. And besides, she went on, if I'd come to you and said, actually, that was my door, can I have it back, pretty please? Do you really expect me to believe you'd have just meekly handed it over?
Yes.
Really? Mr. Tanner's mum looked at him. I wouldn't, if I'd been you. Absolutely no way in hell I'd given it back without fight. But here we are. Probably just as well we aren't all alike. Anyway, there's a door, and now I'm done.
No harm. No harm, Paul thought, and he remembered for the first time what Mr. Dow had told him when he'd entrusted the door to him for safekeeping.
I should warn you, Mr. Dow had said, that you will be able to retrieve it one time only. Once it has been withdrawn from our keeping, the bank's standard terms and conditions clearly state that should you wish to return it to store, a standard administration fee will be payable.
Oh, Paul had said, thinking, aggravating, but that's banks for you. How much?
A life.
Which raised the question he'd faced 3 months ago, when he decided to put the wretched thing safely out of harm's way. Was a door the kind of thing that ought to be left lying around, practically begging every nutcase and psycho and wannabe Dark Lord to get his claws on it? Was it really a suitable present for a 2-week-old baby, or wouldn't a nice bear or a box of building bricks be more suitable? But Mr. Tanner's mum had strolled around, picked it up, and tucked it down inside her profoundly intimidating goblin cleavage. Threat to civilization as we know it, or no threat to civilization as we know it, Paul was buggered if he was going to try and get it back from there. Fine, he decided, not my problem anymore. So that's it, is it? He said, suddenly feeling very tired. Because if you don't need me for anything else today, I think I'd like to pass out from shock and trauma for a bit. Mr. Tanner's mum nodded.
You go ahead, she said. I'll see myself out.
After she'd gone, Paul lay still and quiet on the bed for about 10 minutes, then drifted into the kitchen to see if there was anything to eat. But the fridge was empty, and so was the bread bin and the biscuit jar, and he didn't have the strength to trail down the stairs and yomp the 50 endless yards to the corner shop. Nothing else for it, therefore, but to drive a stake through his finer feelings and eat the slice of christening cake. It was sticky, bitter, and tasted disconcertingly of sulphur, but it was marginally better than nothing at all. He pulled a face as he crunched up the last scraps of icing, rather like eating the chalk out of the little wooden tray under the blackboard back at school. And then it occurred to him to wonder what was likely to be on the menu at Mr. Dow's place. Nothing, followed by nothing, with a null salad. The thought took away his appetite completely, and he lay on his back on top of the duvet, shoes still on. His mother would have had a fit, staring at the cracks in the ceiling plaster. 3 times he'd been there now, not counting the banking trips with and without Benny Shumway. The first time he'd gone voluntarily, or at least intentionally, unable to see any other course of action, but driven by the absolute necessity of saving Sophie that overrode all priorities. The second time had been a screw-up, a dumb misunderstanding by Ricky Worm toward her, but even as the crossbow bolt had sheared through the tissue of Paul's heart, he had known there was a way back, a get-out-of-jail-free card nestling in his sleeve lining. This time he hadn't really believed he was dead until practically the last minute, and then there'd been a couple of lucky chances. The blood on the sword, the portable door in his safe deposit box. For all he knew, there'd be a fourth or a fifth time, and he'd find himself back in the land of the living by the skin of his teeth, thanks to some clever magic trick or prudently stockpiled artefact. But eventually, because of what he was and the terms and conditions governing his existence, a time would come when there'd be no way back. He'd be stuck there forever, like hanging around an airport lounge for all eternity, parted from all his companions and possessions, nothing to eat or drink or read or do, waiting for a flight that had been delayed permanently. The time would come, and everything he did until then was pointless and stupid, building sandcastles in the face of the oncoming tide. Paul thought of Mr. Dowell's well-meant advice. Please deposit all hope tightly in the receptacles provided, because you'll be better off without. Wasn't hope just another lethal addiction, starting as a jolt of something to help you through the day, developing into a habit, then a craving, then a slow poison? Hope binds the addict to its needle, nurturing the old lie that each beat of the heart, each lungful of air is a useful prevarication, keeping all options open. The truth was, Mr. Dowell, and the floor that was no floor, and the sky that wasn't actually there, and sitting watching stalactites grow and a slow drip from the leak of the roof, gouging the Grand Canyon at a solid rock. When Paul had been a boy, he'd lain awake worrying himself sick about what would happen when the sun burnt itself out and the sky went cold, only 1 billion or so years from now. But he'd fretted unnecessarily, he realised, because whatever happened to stars and planets and galaxies, whether they burned up or crashed into asteroids or broke up into dust and got caught up in the drag of a dead gas giant, swirling forever like the skirts of a pirouetting dancer, it'd make no difference at all. Mr. Dowell would still be there when all the stars had gone out and the whole sky full of flying rocks had eventually come to rest, even if, by diabolical cunning and supreme sublime genius, Paul outlasted the last little drop of water and grain of sand, he'd still have a reservation in the kingdom of the dead, a place assigned and waiting for him, a home to go to when the adventures were all over. Nice, cheerful things to think about at 3 o'clock in the morning. At 9:01 the next morning, Paul rang J.W. and, knowing the drill, asked to speak to Christine, Mr. Tanner's secretary. It's Paul, he said. Just let you know I'm not feeling well, so I won't be coming in today. He could picture the stormy crease of her eyebrows. What's wrong with you? I died. Pause. You don't sound very dead to me. I sort of got better, Paul admitted, but it's only temporary. Sooner or later, I'll have a relapse, then that'll be it. Kaboom, finito. So really, there's not a lot of point in me coming in, is there? Christine wasn't the sharpest serpent's tooth in the kindergarten, but she could spot a rhetorical question when she heard one. Have you got a doctor's note? What? No, I haven't. But you could ask Benny Shumway to check with Mr. Dow at the bank if you like. He'll tell you that I'm telling the truth, and you can't get more authoritative than that, can you? But Christine wasn't so easily fobbed off. It says in the book that you're entitled to sick leave, she said. Doesn't say anything about death leave. You hang on there a minute while I go and check with Mr. Tanner. To Paul's great surprise, Mr. Tanner was prepared to let him have a day off, not just one in fact, but the traditional 3. If, however, he hadn't risen again from the dead on the 3rd day, he'd better be able to have a death certificate, a valid will and a little urn of ashes ready for inspection when he finally did condescend to show up, or the old cliché about a fate worse than death might suddenly take on new and startlingly vivid penumbras of meaning. At first, Paul was taken aback by this unexpected display of compassion. Then it occurred to him that Mr. Tanner might well be taking his orders in the manner from his mother. 3 whole days. True. Paul remained painfully conscious of the fact that he was still squatting in a cell on nature's death row, waiting for his rendezvous with the big chair. But even so, the thought of 3 days off, 5 in fact, since tomorrow was Saturday, and even Mr. Tanner couldn't expect him to be dead on his own time, was enough to bring a huge grin to his face. As soon as he'd hung up the phone, he grabbed a sheet of paper and did some calculations. His finances were in their usual dismal state, but if he scrimped and saved for the rest of the month, made do with mousetrap cheese on plastic toast, and washed down with tap water, he could just about afford a little impromptu holiday. He could go away. The prospect stunned him. It'd been 9 months, more than 9 months, since he'd been out of London, except on grim and horrible official business. It was, he remembered, summer, He could borrow a tent, get on a coach, head off into the green and pleasant stuff, to fresh air and lush green grass and soldier ants in the ground sheet. He hadn't been camping since he was a kid, actually. He'd loathed the one time they'd gone camping and had spent the whole holiday praying for the rain to wash the tent away so they could go home. But camping was all he could afford. And what the hell was the point in being temporarily officially dead if you had to spend your limited ration of afterlife cooped up in a grotty bedsit watching daytime TV? By an amazing coincidence, the unemployed guitarist who lived on the floor above had a tent, which he wouldn't be needing again till Glastonbury. Paul bumped into him on the stairs as he went to empty the bins, raised the subject hopefully, and 5 minutes later returned to base with a black plastic sack containing the tent tucked safely under his arm. Great, he thought, as he threw a few items of clothing into a Tesco's bag. I've got everything I need, including my portable shelter. Wonderful. I've scrambled so far up the evolutionary ladder that I'm almost on equal terms with a snail. It had to be the seaside, because the only happy memory from his childhood that Paul could still call back at every time, without fail, with perfect focus and total recall, was a week he'd spent at Weston-super-Mare when he'd been 8. True, it had rained for 5 of the 7 days, and while it was raining his parents had sulked and snapped, and he'd read his comic at least 24 times, to the point where even now he could draw most of it with his eyes shut. But when it hadn't been raining, he'd sat on the beach and he'd built sandcastles, and played beach football with Dad, and paddled in rock pools, and persecuted small, strange-looking crustaceans among the seaweed. As he sat on the train, eyes shut, waiting for the slightly vertiginous judder that meant they were underway, he played back the scene one more time, just to make sure he was still there. Anybody looking at him would have assumed he was asleep and dreaming, but it was far, far better than any dream, because it had come true. Once, and the past is perfect. It's closed off and sealed, watertight and time-tight, so that nothing can leak into it and spoil it. He knew he was grinning all over his face, and the other passengers in the compartment probably thought he was drunk or stoned or peculiar, but he didn't care. He'd died often enough not to worry about what people on trains thought about him. Then a flexing of the seat cushion under his bum told Paul that someone had sat down next to him. Instinctively, he shifted to make room and opened his eyes. Shit, he thought. Thought it was you, said Mr. Laertes, frowning at him. What are you doing on a train? You're supposed to be ill in bed. As always, Mr. Laertes had a disconcertingly unfinished look about him, the sort of mildly annoying failure to convince you to associate with the computer-generated animation in the movies. The light and shadows didn't seem quite right under his eyes and beside his nose, and there were gaps in the way he moved, as though a few frames were missing. Paul said. I was looking for you first thing, Mr. Laertes went on. You weren't in your room, so I asked Christine, and she said you were off sick, at death's door, she said. Paul sighed. There had been a time when something like this, being caught skiving by the boss, would have been his worst nightmare. He was still fundamentally the same person who used to think that way, and it was a habit that he needed to break. Oddly enough, dying the first 2 times hadn't cured him of his naughty schoolboy complex, but this last time he'd come so close. So he grinned. Yep, he said. Literally. Only some clown locked it just as I was about to go through, so had to go the long way round. Mr. Laertes froze for a moment. The look on his face put Paul in a mind of a diplomat of the United Nations, waiting for the simultaneous translation. Presumably you mean the door in the cashier's office, he said. I heard about that, but surely that was months ago, before I even joined the firm. That hadn't been what Paul was expecting. Still, he wasn't being told off either. This was yesterday, he said. Actually, he added, frowning, yesterday and the day before, because the christening was in the evening, right? After work. But when I tried to get through Benny's door, he was just coming back from the bank. I must have been down there a whole day. Mr. Laertes raised a faintly 2-dimensional eyebrow. I haven't got the faintest idea what you're talking about, he said. And talking of the christening, where did you get to? You were supposed to be the godfather, weren't you? But I didn't see you there. You didn't? A tiny flicker of doubt snagged Paul's attention, like a trout fly dragged through murky water. You didn't see the cake with the girls jumping out? Cake? Oh, right, yes, I saw that. But you didn't see me? I was the one cutting it, and then... Ah, got you, Mr. Laertes nodded. That would explain a lot. What were you doing on the wrong side of Mr. Shumway's door, for one thing? But you got back, evidently. It was as though someone else was running Paul's mind. Not an invasion or a hostile takeover, more as though a kind friend had said to him, "You look really tired, you relax for 10 minutes and I'll hold the fort for you." Now this kind friend was telling him that it'd be good to confide in Mr. Leartides, who seemed a nice enough bloke, even if he was a partner, and he'd be far less likely to get into trouble for skiving off work if he just fessed up and told the truth. Personally, Paul thought the kind friend was either drunk or exceptionally stupid, but it was out of his hands, unfortunately. I saw Mr. Dow got the door," he heard himself say. "Oh, and I was able to get that far because there was still a bit of blood left on the sword." Mr. Leartides was perfectly still, apart from a tiny flicker around the edges. "Maybe you'd like to start at the beginning," he said. So Paul told him all about it, straight through to the point where Mr. Tanner's mum had brought him the slice of cake and left him to eat it. When he'd finished, Mr. Leartides steepled his fingers and pressed them to his lips, a study in profound thought by an undistinguished pupil of Rodin. "But that doesn't make sense," he said. Paul had to grin at that. "Which bit did you have in mind?" he said. "The sword," Mr. Leartides said. "Everything else is pretty straightforward, though, if you don't mind me saying so. I think you might be a bit more careful choosing your friends in future. It's fine for Rosie Tanner to say it was simple and obvious what you had to do to escape, but she wasn't the one having to do it. But that's beside the point, and we can all be a tad thoughtless at times. Now, what I can't figure out is this sword thing." Mr. Leartides wasn't making any effort to keep his voice down, but the other passengers in the compartment, which was almost full, didn't seem to be taking any notice. "Don't worry about it," he said with a faint smile, as though he could read Paul's thoughts. "They can't see us chatting. What they think they can see is you fast asleep and me talking very loudly into my mobile phone about some really boring meeting I'm late for. So they aren't really listening to me. A simple first-level glamour, your basic Jedi mind trick. I can teach you how to do that in 5 minutes flat if you're interested." "Can you? I mean, that'd be really kind of you, of course, only—" Mr. Leartides shrugged. "The offer's still open. Working in my department for a couple of months. Once you finish with Theo, entirely up to you, but you don't have to decide yet, of course. But about the sword, you said you kept it with you after you—" "It died," Paul said. "Yes, that's right. The goblins killed me, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting in this television studio, and I still had the sword in my hand." "Extraordinary," Mr. Leartides said, and the intensity in his voice was rather unsettling. "That's not supposed to happen. Really it isn't. You know the saying, you can't take it with you. Absolutely true, no exceptions. The very most you can do is to have it sent on to wait arrival, but that's a different procedure entirely." He sat scowling thoughtfully for 3 seconds and leaned forward a little. "So what became of it?" he asked. "The sword, I mean. Did you leave it down there, in the underworld?" Paul shrugged. I'm not sure," he said. "I think I must still have had it when I ran out the door, but after that I'm not sure. No, hang on, I remember wondering where it got to after I tried to get through the door and it was shut. I suppose I must have dropped it down there somewhere, but I didn't get round to looking for it because that was when Mr. Dow showed up again, and I suddenly thought of using the portable door, and of course that shoved the sword clean out of my mind." "Ah." Mr. Leartides didn't relax, but he turned down the volume of his body language a little. "In which case, presumably it's lost down there forever, which is a pity. I'd like to have seen this remarkable object. Where did you say you got it from?" "At the christening. It sort of fell off at my feet out of nowhere, or they chucked it down for me to use. There was a bit of pink ribbon wrapped around the hilt, if that's any help." "Pink?" Paul nodded. "Pink. That's the one thing I'm positive about. Goblin taste, you see." But Mr. Leartides shook his head. "Clearly you don't know," he said, "but goblins, in their own proper shape, as opposed to masquerading as humans or other species, are violently allergic to the colour pink. It hurts them, literally, like burning. They can't touch anything pink. They can't even look at it for very long unless they're wearing special red filter sunglasses." He looked up and his eyes were very deep, the follow-you-round-the-room eyes of a high-class painting. "So it wasn't the goblins who gave you the sword. In fact, whoever put it in there for you to find also booby-trapped it, so to speak, so that no goblin would touch it." "I see," Paul said. "And if the Brothers Grimm had been running the universe, his nose would have grown maybe a quarter of an inch. So, Mr. Leartides said, "it must have been put there by someone who wanted to help you. A friend. Someone," he added, "who also knew in advance what you were likely to be up against, presumably." "Really? Why's that?" Maybe there are still people in this world who go around carrying magic swords with them wherever they go as a matter of course. But the pink ribbon, the goblin-proofing if you like, strongly suggests forethought and preparation. So you've got an anonymous ally, a well-informed anonymous ally, which is even better. Like you, at some more appropriate time you can try and figure out who it could possibly have been. That still doesn't explain, he went on, what you're doing out of the office during working hours when there isn't actually anything wrong with you.
Oh, Paul thought.
Really, he said. Dying doesn't count as being ill then? But you aren't dead, and otherwise you're as fit as a fiddle. Mr. Tanner gave me the day off, Paul suddenly remembered. 3 days, actually. I phoned Christine this morning and she checked with him. He said it'd be all right.
Ah, Mr. Laertides nodded gravely. That's all right then. And presumably you're headed for the coast in the hope that a bit of fresh air will put roses back in your cheeks. Ah, yes, that seems to be in order. He smiled, and Paul felt himself relax. How far are you going? He said.
Brighton, Paul replied.
Really? There's a coincidence. That's where I'm headed. Party conference, he explained. We have quite a few heavyweight political clients, as you'd expect. A simple glamour, like the one I told you about just now, and for a few minutes, just as long as it takes to make a speech, people actually believe what they say. Very basic one-level stuff, but we'd like to make them pay through the nose for it. He paused and gave Paul a look that he didn't like at all. Funny coincidence, really, because the reason I went looking for you this morning back at the office was I was going to ask if you felt like joining me, helping out with a few things. Heavy hint, and Paul was just grateful he hadn't been standing directly underneath as it crashed to earth, or he'd been flattened.
Great, he said with all the sincerity of a government apology. That'll be, He couldn't quite find words to describe what that would be, but Mr. Laertides grinned like a furnace and said, excellent, as though he'd just invented a way of bottling sunshine. Paul gave his mind a savage kick, and it spluttered reluctantly into life. Just a moment, though, he said. I haven't got any clothes with me apart from a spare shirt and, things. No suit, I mean, and it wouldn't reflect well on the firm. Your assistant turning up in scruffy old T-shirt and jeans. Mr. Laertides laughed. He sounded like a studio audience.
That's not a problem, he said. Lean across, you can see a reflection in the window.
Paul did as he was told. There was his face, he'd know it anywhere, but under his chin was a clean white collar and sober blue and grey tie, and across his shoulders a high-class charcoal grey suit. His hair was neatly trimmed and combed, and he looked like an actuary.
Glamour,
Mr. Laertides explained, as Paul glanced quickly down at himself and saw the clothes he'd put on that morning.
Simple little trick, but well worth mastering. For one thing, you can save a fortune. I mean, since when can you afford Armani on what J.W. pays you?
Paul thought about that. So, anybody looking at me?
We'll see you as you appear in a window, yes. Take me, for instance, Mr. Laertides went on, brushing a spot of lint off his immaculate navy chalk-striped lapel. I'm wearing a pyjama jacket with coffee stains down the front, jogging trousers and a pair of old gardening shoes, and, of course, it doesn't only apply to clothes. He smiled. No offence, he said, but I'll bet there's been times in your life when you wished you looked like that.
He pointed at the window and Paul peered over his arm. He saw Mr. Laertides' reflection, and next to it a man he'd never seen before. He'd have remembered if we had. A tall, fair-haired, broad-shouldered, blue-eyed youth, good-looking, intelligent, endlessly likeable, the Greek god of being nice. Instinctively Paul looked round, but there was nobody on the seat apart from Mr. Laertides and himself.
That's me, he mumbled,
and Mr. Laertides grinned and shook his head.
Of course it isn't, he said. Actually, if you really want to know, that's my wife's cousin Larry. Nice enough bloke, got a job in a building society in Cobham, but he happens to be the most good-looking man I can think of offhand.
Of course, he went on, as the image faded and was replaced heartbreakingly with the long, skinny half-wit Paul had gradually reconciled himself to seeing in mirrors over the years.
That look works wonders with middle-aged women in government offices, but it won't do you much good with the chicks. Too clean-cut, sensible, reliable, boring. They'd be much more likely to go for something like... Now then, let me see.
Paul must have looked away for a split second, because the reflection in the grubby window glass was suddenly quite different. Leaner, darker, sharper, more sardonic, and above all, indescribably cool in a black leather jacket and faded denims with ripped knees.
James Dean, Mr. Laertides was saying. John Travolta, the Fonz, Elvis, totally retro, of course, but practically a classic. You'd be fine to see them off with a baseball bat, or maybe you'd prefer...
No, Paul said extremely quickly. That'd do fine, really, except... He hesitated. It's not me, though, is it? I'd look ridiculous in something like that. Mr. Leartide shrugged. Millions of people all over the world look ridiculous, he said, but they can't do anything about it, poor bastards. You, on the other hand... Yes, Paul said thoughtfully, rubbing his chin with his hand. The man in the window had enough designer stubble to provide habitat for 4 dozen partridges, but Paul's chin felt as smooth as glass and familiarly clammy. Me? You can decide for yourself. Paul craned his neck, but all he could see in the window now were trees, cows and countryside. All you have to do is learn a few words. It's perfectly safe. No nasty side effects, no selling your soul to the devil or ugly old paintings hidden up in the loft. From fridge magnet to babe magnet in one easy step. Or, Mr. Leartides added, as the train shot into a tunnel and the window went dark, maybe you've got scruples about cheating, or you simply can't be bothered. I mean, only very shallow people judge by appearances, and you'd rather soldier on, waiting for Mr. Right to love you for who you really are deep down. Or maybe you have deep ethical reservations about inducing someone to love you by supernatural means. He smiled very faintly. Some people have issues about that sort of thing, though God only knows why. No, Paul heard himself shout. I mean, yes, that sounds like it might be rather useful, and it'd get over the problem. He added desperately, of me not having anything smart to wear for this job we're going to. Indeed, Mr. Leartide said gravely. There's that as well. Anyhow, you take your time and think it over, and when you've reached a decision... Yes, please, Paul snapped. Yes, I'd really like to learn how to do that if it wouldn't be any bother. Fine. Mr. Leartides held up his hand, palm facing outwards. You don't actually need the hand movements, but it's easy to learn doing it this way. All you've got to do, he went on, is this. He turned his hand round, pressed it against his face, and started pressing, squeezing, moving things about. First he pushed his eyebrows back a little, then he squidged the sides of his mouth together, pulled his nose to make it longer, used his thumb and forefinger to lift and smooth out his cheekbones, as though his face was a lump of wet clay and he was carefully moulding it into shape. It only took him a few moments, and when he took his hand away, his face had changed completely. Not, it turned out, for the better. He made himself look exactly like Paul. See, he said, it's the first few times you try it. It helps to have a mirror, otherwise you might find you come out looking like cheese on toast, or a Dali watch. Here, he added, and once again he held his hand up. This time the palm seemed to have turned to glass, and Paul could see himself reflected in it. I'm not sure about this, he muttered doubtfully. I mean, surely there's more to it than that, or else... Of course there is, said Mr. Leartides. There's a small matter of natural ability, which is only granted to maybe 1 person in 20 million. But you've got it, just like your Uncle Ernie, rest his vicious soul. So that's all right. Go ahead, he went on. Try it. If you don't like the results, just shake your head a couple of times, and it'll reset to 0. Well, Paul thought, why the hell not? Very cautiously he touched his fingertips to his face and pressed, watching the skin move. What first, he asked himself. Where to begin? There were so many things about his appearance which he hated that for a while he couldn't decide what to tackle first. But his upper lip, that had always annoyed him. He was convinced that it made him look like a chipmunk eating a biscuit. Tentatively he drew it down with the top of his forefinger, pressing it gently against his front teeth. As he let go, he expected to see the skin move back to where it should be, but it didn't. It works, he whispered. Of course it works, silly, said Mr. Leartides. I do this thing for a living, remember. Go on, don't stop, you're doing fine. So Paul tried again. This time he pushed his nose back a little with the heel of his hand, smoothed out the irritating bump halfway along, squidged the ridge between finger and thumb to make it thinner and less pudgy. That didn't look quite right, though. In order to be any good, it needed the cheeks to be a bit flatter, the chin a tad more pointed, and he definitely had to do something about his ghastly wing-mirror ears. Too much? Steady on, Mr. Leartides warned. Your problem is you know what you don't like. You're not so sure about what you want instead. What you've done, you don't look handsome. You just look like someone's pressed you in a book like a daisy. What I usually suggest is get an idea in your mind of what you're working towards. Easy way to think of a face you know, a movie star or a TV personality, and try and make yourself look like that. In your case, he mused, I'd go for either Leo DiCaprio or the young Hugh Grant. Oh, and don't forget the teeth, he added. There's a mistake a lot of people make. They get the rest of their faces just right, and as soon as they open their mouths, they look like a shark trying to swallow a keyboard. Paul had always been hopeless with plasticine and making clay models in art at school, but he found that if he just concentrated on the picture in his mind and stopped looking at his reflection, it was much easier. There, he said a few minutes later. How's that? It's an improvement, Mr. Leartide said. It has to be admitted, though, that's not saying a whole lot. No reflection on you, no pun intended. But you've got the sort of looks that most things improve, second-degree burns included. It all seemed to take forever, and then quite suddenly everything seemed to come right and fit together. That's it, Mr. Leartide called out. You've got it now, see? Told you it was dead simple. Actually, he added, his eyebrows drawing together, that's not bad at all. Didn't I say I thought you had a flair for this sort of work? Paul looked away from the window for a moment or so to reset his perceptions and then looked back. The face he saw in the glass was... Years of thoroughly justifiable modesty were getting in the way, but there was no call for any of that, since the face wasn't his, after all. But it was strikingly handsome. Straight nose, high cheekbone, square jaw, finely tapered chin, large, well-spaced eyes, firm mouth, not too narrow or too broad, a basically serious face, but fully equipped to handle a wide spectrum of emotions. He ventured a smile, and was agreeably startled by the flash of warmth, like a sunlight breaking through clouds and flooding a deep valley. He tried a laugh. When Paul Carpenter laughed, he looked like a baboon, but you could practically see the great golden soul behind this face peeping out of you through the windows of the eyes. He ran through a basic repertoire of expressions. Brave, stern, compassionate, caring, happy, sad, serious, playful, and stopped because it was unbearably frustrating, because this was the face he should have been born with, if only there had been any justice in the world. With a face like this he could have been somebody, a contender, not just because it was cute and hunky and guaranteed surefire girl catnip, though of course that would have solved or more likely preempted a great many of the personality defects that the real Paul Carpenter had had to deal with all these years. It was more than that, though. He could have been himself in a face like this, instead of having to tailor his hopes, aspirations, objectives, expectations to suit the jumble of skin, bone, muscle and cartilage he'd been issued with when he was born. All his life, he realised bitterly, he'd had to be the boy who looked like a bolted Brussels sprout plant, the clown, the butt, always left over when teams were picked, always on his own in the playground during break. And how stupid, how arbitrary to allocate him to that village idiot duties simply on the basis of nose length and ear configuration. You might as well choose somebody to be president of the USA on the grounds that he could spit further than anybody else. What's the matter? Mr. Leartides was saying. You look like someone's just filled your inside pocket with treacle. Don't you like it? Oh, I like it a lot, Paul mumbled. That's the problem. Is it? Why? Paul turned sharply and looked away. Because it's not me is why. Because I've got to give it back and carry on being chimp boy for the rest of my life. It's not fair. Mr. Leartides chuckled, and for some reason the floor under Paul's feet shook slightly. Come on, sunshine, how old are you, 9? Is that hypocrisy or what? You're getting all stressy because it's not fair that people judge by appearances. But what the hell else are you doing every time you fall in love at first sight? Think about it. At first sight. What kind of attitude is that for crying out loud? You must be so shallow. It's a miracle you haven't evaporated yet. Yeah, well, Paul shrugged. Like, it would have made a lot of difference if I'd fallen in love with girls because they're warm, caring human beings who want to work with disabled children and dream about world peace. They'd still have told me to drop dead because I've got a face like a Disney character. Not that it matters anyhow, he added briskly, because I'm through with all that now. Thanks, he added with a slight frown, to you and that medicine you made for me. I mean, because of that, isn't all this sort of thing a bit irrelevant? There's other things in life, said Mr. Leartides, besides getting off with girls. Or had you forgotten about that? No, really. There's being taken seriously, for a start. Having people predisposed to like you, willing to hear you out, listen to what you've got to say. I know none of that stuff's in the same league as being able to pick up women in bars, but it might just be worth making a tiny effort now and again, don't you think? Paul nodded. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. But it still doesn't matter a toss, because sooner or later I've got to go back to being Coco the Clown. That's where I live, he said harshly. And anything else would just be a short holiday I couldn't afford to pay for. Mr. Lairtide's face was completely expressionless. Not necessarily, he said. Not necessarily. Paul was aware that his voice was raised and messy sounding, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. He was angry and he needed to say his piece. Oh, sure. Like, I can walk into the office on Monday morning looking like this. Nobody would believe it was me. True, said Mr. Lairtide quietly. They'd think you were a client or a rep or something. Exactly. I'd be kissing goodbye to my job for one thing. Probably because of the angle of the sun slanting through the tree and window. Mr. Lairtide's face was in shadow. Right, he said. And that'd be a bad thing, of course. The implied "yeah, right" stopped Paul short like a cow standing dead still on a railway line. Well, of course it would, he said. Look, being me isn't a barrel of laughs, but that's who I am. I can't suddenly stop it and go and be somebody else. Mr. Lairtide shrugged just a little. You think so, he said. Oh, it doesn't matter what I think. It's not a matter of opinion, it's just one of those things, that's all. I see. So you're resigned to it, in other words. You're so sure you wouldn't even try something else, even if you had the chance. Paul shook his head. For some reason, Mr. Lairtide seemed to be having trouble understanding him. Look, he said. I'd love a chance of being someone else, like him. He jerked his head sideways in the direction of the window. But it's not possible, so what the hell, right? No. It was probably his tone of voice that did it. Paul looked up sharply. Sorry? I said no, Mr. Lairtide said, meaning if you want to be the bloke in the reflection there, that's no problem. Easy bloody peasy. All it'd take, he added, would be for Paul Carpenter to die, and then gradually, in being tactful about it, you could take his place. Yes, but... And you've already done that, Mr. Lairtide went on. So that's the hard part out of the way. The rest's easy. It's just telling a few lies over and over again until eventually they stop being lies and become true. Now, how much trouble could that be compared with dying and coming back to life again? For a long time, long enough to make a sandwich or wrap a small parcel, Paul said nothing. Then, in a little tiny voice, he asked, What did you have in mind? Ah, Mr. Lairtide's grin was back, gaping in his face like a volcanic fissure. Now we're getting somewhere. Here's what I had in mind. You'll come to Brighton with me and help me out with a few small jobs, nothing boring or yucky, not even doing any magic, just sitting in a corner during meetings, making notes, running a few errands, stuff like that. In return, when I get back to the office on Monday, I'll tell them all you died, yet again. Had a relapse of death, and this time you've copped it. You aren't coming back, and don't worry, they'll believe me, because when they go round to your flat, they'll find a body, and it'll be you, and they'll have an inquest, and then a funeral, and everything all completely legal and above board. Of course, that's what they'll believe, at any rate. Just another basic glamour, really. Paul looked at him. You can do that. In comparison, Mr. Lairtide said confidently, you need 2 first-class honours degrees and a doctorate to fall off a log. Trust me, he added with a grin, that's my job, it's what I do. So there you'll be, dead. No more boring, dumb-looking loser you. Then after a decent interval, like maybe a week, I'll tell Dennis Tanner and the rest of them that I've found someone to take over your job. Enter the new you, and you carry on where you left off, but without the incredibly debilitating handicap of being you. What do you reckon? Sound good to you? But, Paul frowned. His mind was gridlocked with ideas, objections, worries, practicalities, trivia. Why have I got to go back to JWW? He said. If you're so smart, can't you see that I hate it there? Only because you're a pathetic loser, Mr. Lairtide pointed out. New improved Paul Carpenter will get on like a house on fire, probably realise what a really wonderful place it is, and how incredibly lucky he is to work there. Besides, he went on, the whole point of this gig, where I'm sitting, is to get you to come and work for me. It's the price of the deal, take it or leave it. Up to you entirely. Before Paul could stop him, he'd reached over, grabbed Paul's wrist, and held his palm outwards in front of his nose. Your joys, he added, as Paul gawped at the reflection suddenly showing there. You could be him, or you can stay being you. No rush to decide. The offer stays open for the next 3 seconds. Paul froze, counting in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. 1 second left to make a choice like that. It was crazy. He couldn't be expected to make a decision like that in less than a fortnight. 3 Well, asked Mr. Leartides.